If we observe Japan from the outside, we notice a country with advanced robotics technology, an incredible culture, the fourth largest economy in the world, and a healthy population, along with globally famous companies. At first glance, it might seem like an ideal country. However, if you look closer, you can perceive another, less bright reality. While the positive aspects are true, there is a dark side of life in Japan that remains unknown to many. Millions of people in the country face difficulties integrating into society, ending up completely isolated. These people do not have access to job opportunities, marriage, or a normal and happy life. They are known as the Lost Generation, representing about 15% of the Japanese population. Their sad story is a symbol of Japan's fall from its previous status and a sign of deeper disturbances. This is the dark side of Japan, the Lost Generation. Although this is almost forgotten nowadays, in the 1980s, Japan was seen as the next economic superpower that would replace the United States and take control of the global economy, similar to what is currently observed with China. Confidence in this future was so strong that it generated serious anxiety about Japan in the United States. Articles like this one discuss the possibility of an economic Pearl Harbor, portraying a scenario where Japan would buy up all of the United States, and movies like Die Hard, Rising Sun, and Blade Runner all presented the idea of Japanese corporations taking control of America and the world. This anxiety was the result of the Japanese miracle, 3 decades of extraordinary economic growth driven by a unique Japanese economic system that at the time was seen as superior to the Western model. This system was essentially based on cooperation between gigantic corporate cartels and the Japanese government. These cartels, called keiretsu, were alliances of the largest Japanese corporations that held shares in each other and worked together to support one another, receiving substantial support from the government in the form of loans from the state bank. This basically meant that these alliances had access to an apparently infinite amount of capital to finance their aggressive overseas expansion, while at the same time the government blocked foreign companies from entering the Japanese market. Although this system was neither healthy nor fair, it worked in the Japanese market. Japanese companies were conquering one market after another, and ordinary people believed that if they worked hard and obtained a university degree, they would get a stable job in a large corporation, which meant a guarantee of lifelong employment. Japan seemed unstoppable, and everything was going very well until one thing happened. In 1991, Japan was experiencing extremely rapid growth that extended for 3 consecutive decades, consolidating itself as the second largest economy in the world after the United States. During this period, real estate prices and the values of companies listed on the stock exchange were also on the rise. But by the end of the 1980s, this growth reached a point of euphoria and turned into a speculative mania. Basically, everyone believed that the economic boom and asset growth would be eternal, and that the more you invested, the more money you would make. Meanwhile, the Bank of Japan continued to print and lend money practically to anyone who asked, regardless of the purpose of the loan or the credibility of the borrowers. Then one day, the bubble burst. Throughout 1990, the stock market fell 43%, and real estate prices followed the same path. The burst of the bubble meant that ordinary people had much less money to spend, and no one was willing to invest in Japanese companies, which led to the end of the economic boom. Moreover, in the years following the bubble burst, it became evident that corruption was widespread and common in Japanese companies and the government. There were internal dealings to manipulate stocks, fraud, bribery, and an unlimited loan offering practice that created hundreds of zombie companies that should have gone bankrupt years before, but continued to survive thanks to easy access to cheap government loans. In a decade, Japan went from being called an economic tiger to being labeled the sick man of Asia. Although this fall was drastic, it was not unique. The economies of different countries have their ups and downs, which are part of economic life. However, in Japan's case, the recession had devastating effects on an entire generation, and the consequences of this period are still felt today. To understand why this happened, it is necessary to know how the Japanese job market works and its hiring culture, which, to say the least, is extremely intense and presents various aspects that make it quite different from any other job market in the world. A corporate career in Japan usually starts with Shushoku Katsudo, a unique job search ritual in Japan that university graduates face after completing their studies. Many companies, including the largest keiretsu, hire only recent graduates once a year in large numbers. The recent graduates go through a job search process filled with group interviews and seminars where thousands of people dressed in identical black and white suits compete. At the end of this process, they get a job and generally keep that job for decades until retirement. This practice is known as Chushin Koyo, or lifetime employment. These practices, which were common in the 1990s and are still very common in Japan today, provide stability but also create an incredibly rigid job market. If you do not get a good job after university, it is unlikely that you will get a second chance. Once hired, it is expected that you will stay in the same company for your entire career, but if you do not get hired, you are left out, and the doors of most companies will remain closed forever. However, when the economic bubble burst and the economic boom ended, this ritual was broken. After 1990, most companies froze their hiring entirely for almost a decade, keeping all existing employees during the economic crisis. They eventually resumed hiring in the new century, but finding a job has become much more difficult since then. For an entire generation of people who graduated in the 1990s, it was too late. Companies were no longer hiring graduates, and as a result, millions of people were left behind, destined to spend the rest of their lives in temporary and poorly paid jobs. This period became known as the Employment Ice Age, and the people who graduated at that time were labeled the Lost Generation. Since the Japanese economy never fully recovered, young people who graduated in the following decades, in the 2000s and 2010s, joined them, and the period of the last 30 years became collectively known as the Lost Decades. The situation of the lost generation in Japan is not just a tragedy for those who are part of it. It negatively affects the entire Japanese society and casts a dark shadow over the country's future. This generation, now aged between 30 and 40 years old, is largely missing from the job market, often financially dependent on their parents, and unable to start their own families or progress in their careers. Comprising nearly 17 million people, this age group is essential for the economy of any country. However, in Japan, this group of people who would normally spend more on housing, shopping, and sustain economic growth is absent. This is partly due to the so-called Employment Ice Age, a period after the economic bubble burst when companies froze hiring, leaving many graduates without job opportunities. Moreover, Japan faces the challenge of super-aging, with almost 30% of the population being elderly. This is exacerbated by the fact that many of the lost generation have not been able to establish their careers or families, which means they are not contributing to the economically active population. If this trend continues, it will lead to an increasingly unbalanced ratio between the elderly and the working-age population, which is unsustainable in the long term. Additionally, there is the phenomenon of hikikomori, Japanese men who completely isolate themselves from society, often financially dependent on their parents. Initially composed of members of the lost generation, now in their 30s to 40s, this phenomenon is expanding to other younger generations unable to cope with the stress and competitiveness of the Japanese job market. The Japanese government recognizes the negative impacts of these problems on society and the economy, and has attempted to implement measures to help the lost generation recover and reintegrate into society. However, the success of these initiatives has been limited due to the persistence of a rigid work culture and the lack of opportunities for those who do not fit the traditional lifetime employment model. As a result, millions of people are trapped in this cycle of hopelessness, and the problem continues to grow as more young people struggle to find their place in the Japanese job market. As long as the Japanese economy remains stagnant and the work culture does not adapt to the needs of modern workers, the future of this generation and Japanese society as a whole remains uncertain. Now, tell us what caught your attention the most. If you made it to the end of this video, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This encourages me to continue bringing more content. See you in the next video.